The 80-20 rule of finding a good dental practice is an inviolable law of how to actually find a good practice for sale. When I'm helping buyers, which is something we do dozens, if not hundreds of times a year, dozens of times a month, probably 5, 6, 7 times a day, I get the question, Brian, I want to live in Des Moines, Iowa, or I want to live in this area of Boston, or I can't wait to move to Bremerton, Washington. And you wouldn't believe it, Brian, there are no good practices for sale. This is by far the most common thing told to me by buyers. And the simple truth is, while they could be right, they're probably wrong. And the 80-20 rule is a way to help buyers think about how to actually find a good practice in an area where they want to live. All right, so what's the 80 and what's the 20? There are 2 ways to find a good dental practice to buy. You can either find one on market, this is with a broker, someone who has listed the practice for sale officially somewhere, or you can find it off market. Off market is someone who wants to sell their business but hasn't engaged a professional to do so or hasn't listed it professionally. All right, so on market, off market. The 80-20 rule, very simply, is to spend 20% of your search time. Whatever time you're going to allocate to searching for a good dental practice to buy, spend 20% of your time with the on-market search. Brokers, websites, Facebook, Dentaltown, the list goes on, okay? 80% of your time should be spent searching for off-market practices. I'll talk about exactly how to do that, but first I want to share an analogy, because this is the point where people come to me and they say, gosh, Brian, that sounds like you're about to teach me something really hard to do, and you're not wrong. But the next logical thought that a lot of people have is the wrong thought to have. The next logical thought they have is, great, can I pay you to do this for me? Can I pay you to find the practice for me? And the short answer to that is no, and not because I'm lazy, although that is partially true. I can't find your practice for you because the act of finding a practice to buy, a good practice to buy, usually happens off market, though not always, and we'll talk about that. And it's a personal one-to-one connection that gets made between the buyer and seller. Thus, if I insert myself into the process, it just doesn't work. The admittedly somewhat terrible analogy is like finding a good dental practice to buy is a lot like finding a spouse to marry, all right? The analogy falls apart at a certain point, but I can teach you the principles of finding a spouse to marry. Be a good first date. Go to these websites, have these apps on your phone, do these things, and eventually you might find a spouse to marry. The same general principles apply in finding a good practice to buy. There are lots of practices for sale, but maybe none that you're interested in. And the way to find the good practice to buy is usually to look off market. If you spend all of your time searching on market, in other words, brokers' websites, study clubs, state dental board websites, classified ads, things like that, here's the problem with that approach. The economics of selling your practice dictate that you as the buyer, if you're searching, you're probably looking at the leftovers. You're probably looking at the practices that either no one else wanted to buy, no one else wanted to list, or the seller was forced to go in the direction of looking more publicly for a buyer because they couldn't find one for their practice. Why is that? Why would it be true that it's not like buying a home, right? When you go to buy a house, there is a central database of homes for sale. You go look, there's a couple for sale by owners that nobody really gets or sees, but for the most part, every house for sale is in the same place. It's just not true. That's not how dental practice sales work. Unfortunately, that'd be great if it did. Pretend you're a seller for a second. You're in the twilight of your career. You're thinking about selling and you don't have an imminent timeline. In other words, there's no major health issue. There's no major deadline causing you to sell your practice on XYZ date. And let's say you've got a good practice, collects over $1 million, great overhead, 5 operatories, great neighborhood, a place where people want to live, all right? And you are just looking at your practice and you're thinking to yourself, I can probably sell this thing for 70, 80, 85, maybe even 90% of collections. And I know that I have a good practice for sale. As a seller, you've got two options. You can try to find your own buyer and do the process yourself, or you can hire a broker who. So if you've got a practice that's collecting $1 million, and let's just say this is a phenomenal practice that could sell for 85% of collections, that's $850,000. The cost to hire the broker is $85,000, 10% of the sales price of the practice. That's a big chunk of money. And so if you're a seller and those are your two choices, you might tend to try to list that market or find the buyer yourself before you go hire a broker and pay 10%. Thus, there tend to be really good practices for sale off market. The trick, of course, is that they're really hard to find. You should still spend 20% of your time looking with a broker because it is a developed market and brokers still do get good listings from time to time. Two reasons you should still search with a broker. Number one, there are going to still be good practices for sale through brokers. And number two, it is easier. You are going to be able to just browse a website or passively get emails sent to your inbox. It's not a waste of time. It's just not where you should spend all of your time. There is something to be said for using that 20% search time to get a feel for the market where you're looking. I use Des Moines, Iowa, for example. Let's say there's a handful of listings that come on the market every month in Des Moines, Iowa. I think that's actually true because I've helped a few buyers there. And if you are the one watching what comes through the broker listings and you get a sense for what's out there and you get a sense for how much they're selling for, that 20% search time, even if you don't buy any of those practices, isn't necessarily wasted because you've gotten a sense now for the market and what's been selling and how long things sit around, what prices, all of those things. So how do you spend 80% of your search time if there are no set resources or rules or email signups or anything like that? So why am I telling you should spend 4/5 of your time doing something that feels so undefined? Let me help put some guardrails around what exactly you should be doing during this time. The overarching principle of your 80% search time is to create and build warm relationships with gray-haired dentists. That's the fundamental principle at play here, is build your network. Not networking, we're not talking schmoozy business card handing out networking, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking build your network of older dentists who know you exist, like you, and know you're in the market for a practice to buy. So what does that look like? Think about how you build relationships elsewhere in your life. Friends, people from church, people at the gym. How do you build relationships with others and then do the same thing with dentists who are a little older than you and might be selling their practice? Some common ways people use their 80% search time for off-market practices to build relationships are mailers and targeted reach-outs. Let me talk about mailers first. Mailers are essentially what credit card companies do. You're going to blast out a postcard, a very simple letter, something with your name on it and some contact information that tells a bunch of dentists that you're in the market for a practice to buy. It's less personal, but you're sending it out to a greater number of people and hoping that somebody responds and you're able to build a relationship with that person. Now that relationship is primarily based on the fact that you're in the market for a practice. So it's a little less warm, a little less personal, but that's okay. It's upfront, it's direct, and it's to the point. And mailers work frequently, often. I have dozens and dozens and dozens of clients who have used mailers to find fantastic practices for sale, their dream practices, through just the simple art of sending a postcard to 500 dentists or a bunch of letters to 300 dentists in this smaller metropolitan area. Mailers work, and they work really well, but they're not the only way to do it. The second way to create relationships with older dentists, to search for a good practice to buy, is actually my preferred way. This is to reach out directly to those sellers and offer them the opportunity to give you some advice, to give you some mentoring, to add some value to your life as a young dentist, with the quid pro quo being that they now know who you are and they're interested in helping you. Now, that interest in helping you can be selling you their practice, but it usually is that they know someone who is then selling their practice. Here's how I would do targeted reach outs directly to personal sellers. I would create a list of dentists in the market where you want to practice. I would reach out to them directly via email, a letter, a phone call, whatever it is. I would follow up, and rather than ask if they're willing to sell their practice, I would simply ask them for some advice on how they've been successful in a market where you want to practice. That gives them the opportunity to create a relationship with you where they think fondly of you and they're going to look out for your well-being. Let's summarize the 80-20 rule. I want you to spend 20% of your time on market with brokers and practices that are listed officially. The other 80% of your time, I want you looking for practices that aren't listed anywhere. I want you creating relationships with dentists who are a little bit older than you and might either sell you their practice or know someone else who's looking to sell their practice. The good practices for sale tend to be off market. So if you want to find a good practice to buy, here's the cold hard truth. Finding a good practice to buy is going to take more work than you're going to be really excited to do. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but good practices aren't falling from the trees. You got to put in some work, you got to put in some effort, and you have to be willing to do things that other potential buyers aren't willing to do. If all you want to do is browse brokers' listings from the comfort of your pajamas at home, you're not going to have the same opportunities someone else who's willing to put in some elbow grease is going to find. If this was helpful for you, I have a ton more resources, even better organized in a lot of different places. The first place to go is my website, dentalbuyeradvocates.com. All the stuff there is free. Another good resource is my podcast. It's called Practice Purchased. It's totally free. There are no advertisements, and I have a whole season dedicated to how to find a practice for sale. I've got a book for sale on Amazon where I give chapter and verse on talking to brokers, looking off market. And I've even got a course where I break down how to do mailers, how to reach out to people, what exactly should be in this whole process. You can find all of these resources at dentalbuyeradvocates.com, or you're welcome to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to be a resource for you and to see what I can do to help you find a great practice for sale.